At the family gathering, my daughter said, "I'll take her house soon," but the room went silent when I showed the sale papers. The laughter around my Thanksgiving table died instantly when my daughter Melanie leaned back in her chair with the kind of smug satisfaction that meant she was about to deliver what she thought was winning news. "Don't worry about Grandma Ruth's house sitting empty much longer," she announced to the assembled family, her voice carrying across the dining room with theatrical confidence. "I'll be taking it over soon. It's practically mine already." The silence that followed was thick with assumptions, calculations, and the kind of family politics that emerge whenever property and inheritance intersect. What Melanie didn't know, what none of them knew, was that I'd been carrying a manila envelope in my purse all evening, waiting for exactly this moment. The sale papers inside would prove that sometimes the people who assume they know everything about family business are the ones who understand the least about family loyalty. But let me start from the beginning, because this story isn't just about houses or inheritance. It's about what happens when entitlement meets reality, and how sometimes protecting someone you love means letting them learn hard lessons in public. Ruth Henderson had been my mother-in-law for 32 years, ever since I married her son Michael when we were both 23, and thought we understood everything about building a life together. Ruth was 87 now, a sharp-minded woman who had spent the last 5 years in Sunset Manor, an assisted living facility that provided the medical support and social interaction she needed while maintaining her independence and dignity. Ruth's house sat on 3 acres of prime real estate in suburban Nashville, a property she'd owned since 1965, when she and Michael's father bought it as young parents planning to raise their family in a place with room to grow. The house itself was a modest ranch-style home, but the land it sat on had become increasingly valuable as Nashville's growth pushed suburban development farther from the city center. The property was worth well over $500,000 now, a sum that represented not just Ruth's largest asset, but also the primary inheritance that her descendants had been anticipating since she'd moved to assisted living. Ruth had 4 children. My husband Michael, his sister Patricia, his brother David, and his youngest sister Karen, and the general family assumption was that the house would eventually be sold and the proceeds divided among them. But assumptions, as our family was about to learn, can be dangerous things when they're not based on actual conversations or legal documents. My daughter Melanie, now 28 and working as a marketing coordinator for a tech startup, had always been Ruth's obvious favorite among the grandchildren. Ruth had helped pay for Melanie's college education, had given her a car for graduation, and had made no secret of her special affection for the granddaughter who shared her love of gardening, cooking, and what Ruth called proper family values. Melanie had been visiting Ruth regularly at Sunset Manor, spending Saturday afternoons helping with personal care tasks, bringing home-cooked meals, and providing the kind of attentive companionship that elderly people in institutional settings often lack. Her devotion to Ruth was genuine and touching, and it had earned her not just Ruth's gratitude, but also her growing confidence about her position in Ruth's estate plans. Over the past year, Melanie had begun making comments that suggested she expected to inherit Ruth's house, either exclusively or as the primary beneficiary. She'd talked about renovation plans, about the garden improvements she wanted to make, and about how she looked forward to carrying on Grandma Ruth's legacy in the family home. These comments had made me increasingly uncomfortable, not because I objected to Melanie inheriting property from Ruth, but because I suspected that Melanie's expectations were based more on her own assumptions than on any actual promises or legal commitments from Ruth. When I gently asked Melanie about the source of her confidence regarding the house, she'd been vague but insistent. "Grandma Ruth and I have talked about it," she'd said. "She knows how much the house means to me, and she knows I'm the one who's been taking care of her. It's basically understood that the house will come to me." But basically understood isn't the same as legally documented, and I'd been growing concerned that Melanie was setting herself up for disappointment, or worse, for conflict with Michael's siblings, who might have very different ideas about how Ruth's estate should be handled. My concerns had intensified 3 months ago when I'd learned that Melanie had been asking Ruth to sign various documents during their visits. Melanie claimed these were routine paperwork related to Ruth's care at Sunset Manor, but the assisted living facilities staff had no record of requiring any additional documentation from residents or their families. When I'd mentioned Melanie's document requests to Michael, he'd shared my concerns, but had been reluctant to confront our daughter directly. "Maybe she's just trying to help Ruth get organized," Michael had suggested. "You know how much Melanie cares about details and planning." But I'd suspected that Melanie's help with Ruth's paperwork might be more self-serving than helpful, and I decided to have my own conversation with Ruth about her estate planning and her intentions for the house. That conversation, which had taken place 6 weeks ago in Ruth's cheerful apartment at Sunset Manor, had revealed a situation that was far more complicated than anyone in our family had understood. "Ruth," I'd said during one of my visits, "Melanie seems to think that you're planning to leave her the house. I wanted to make sure you're comfortable with any expectations that might be developing around your estate plans." Ruth's response had been immediate and clear. "I love Melanie dearly," Ruth had said, "but I've never promised her the house or any other specific inheritance. I've told all my children and grandchildren that my estate will be handled fairly and according to my wishes, but I haven't shared the details of those wishes with anyone." Ruth had gone on to explain that she'd been working with an estate planning attorney for several months to organize her affairs, but that she deliberately kept the details private to avoid exactly the kind of family conflict that premature inheritance discussions often create. "I've seen too many families torn apart by arguments over money and property," Ruth had told me. "I'm handling my estate planning carefully and professionally, and everyone will learn about my decisions when the time is appropriate." But then, Ruth had shared information that had shocked me and explained why she'd been so secretive about her estate planning. "Actually, Janet," Ruth had said, "I've already made the most important decision about the house. I sold it last month." The revelation that Ruth had sold the house without telling anyone in the family had been stunning, but Ruth's explanation of her reasoning had made perfect sense from her perspective. "I decided that the house was too much of a burden to leave to my children," Ruth had explained. "The property taxes are high, the maintenance costs are significant, and the house itself needs major renovations that would be expensive and time-consuming. I didn't want to saddle my children with a property that would cause them financial stress or family arguments." Ruth had sold the house to a developer who planned to subdivide the land and build several smaller homes, a sale that had netted her enough money to ensure her long-term care costs were covered, while also providing a substantial inheritance to divide among her children. "I'm using the proceeds from the sale to establish trust funds for each of my children," Ruth had told me. "They'll receive their inheritances while I'm still alive to see them benefit, and they won't have to deal with the complications of managing real estate or making decisions about whether to keep or sell family property." Ruth's decision to sell the house and distribute the proceeds through trust funds was financially savvy and emotionally wise, but it was also information that she'd asked me to keep confidential until she was ready to announce her decision to the rest of the family. "I'm planning to tell everyone at Christmas," Ruth had said. "I want to give each of my children their trust fund documentation as Christmas gifts so they can start the new year with financial security and peace of mind." But Ruth had also shared her concerns about Melanie's increasingly possessive behavior regarding the house and her suspicions about the documents that Melanie had been asking her to sign. "Melanie has been very insistent about me signing papers that she says are just routine," Ruth had told me. "But when I asked to read them carefully before signing, she seemed frustrated and told me I was being unnecessarily cautious. That made me uncomfortable." Ruth had decided to stop signing any documents that Melanie brought her and to have her attorney review any paperwork related to her care or estate planning, a decision that had apparently frustrated Melanie and led to some tense conversations between grandmother and granddaughter. "I love Melanie, but I'm concerned that she's developed expectations about my property that aren't realistic," Ruth had confided. "I hope that when she learns about the trust fund I'm establishing for your family, she'll understand that I've been trying to be fair to everyone while also making practical decisions about my assets." After my conversation with Ruth, I'd been carrying the burden of knowing that Melanie's expectations about inheriting the house were not just unrealistic, but completely impossible, since the house had already been sold. But I'd also been bound by my promise to Ruth to keep the information confidential until she was ready to make her announcement. That promise had become increasingly difficult to keep as Melanie's comments about the house had become more frequent and more presumptuous. She'd started talking about the house as if it were already hers, making plans for renovations and improvements that would cost tens of thousands of dollars and require years of work. More troubling, Melanie had begun excluding other family members from conversations about Ruth's care and future plans, positioning herself as the primary decision-maker for her grandmother's affairs, despite having no legal authority or official role in Ruth's care management. The situation had come to a head last week when Patricia, Michael's sister, had called to express concerns about Melanie's behavior during family visits to Ruth. "Melanie acts like she owns Ruth and makes decisions for her," Patricia had told me. "She's been telling other family members not to bother Ruth with visits, because Ruth is too tired for company, but then she spends hours there herself every week. Patricia had also mentioned that Melanie had been asking Ruth's siblings about their own estate planning and inheritance expectations, conversations that had made everyone uncomfortable because they felt inappropriately intrusive. "I'm worried that Melanie is trying to manipulate Ruth into changing her will or giving her preferential treatment," Patricia had said. "Someone needs to talk to her about appropriate boundaries before she causes serious family problems." But before I could decide how to address Patricia's concerns, Ruth had called me with urgent news that changed everything. "Janet," Ruth had said during a phone call that came on Tuesday morning, "I need to move up my timeline for telling the family about the house sale. Melanie has been pressuring me to sign a document that would give her power of attorney over my financial affairs, and I think she's planning to use that authority to challenge the house sale or claim ownership of the property." Ruth's suspicions about Melanie's intentions had been confirmed when she'd consulted with her attorney about the power of attorney document that Melanie had been pressuring her to sign. "My attorney reviewed the document and told me it was unnecessarily broad and would give Melanie complete control over all my financial decisions," Ruth had explained. "When I told Melanie I wasn't comfortable signing it, she became very upset and accused me of not trusting her after everything she's done for me." Ruth had decided that she needed to reveal the truth about the house sale before Melanie could create legal complications or family conflicts based on false expectations. "I'm going to tell everyone at your Thanksgiving dinner," Ruth had said. "I was hoping to wait until Christmas, but I think waiting longer would be unfair to Melanie and potentially harmful to our family relationships." Ruth had asked me to bring the sale documents to Thanksgiving dinner so that she could present them to the family as proof of her decision and explain her reasoning for the sale. But Ruth's health had taken a turn for the worse the day before Thanksgiving, and her doctor had recommended that she avoid the stress and exertion of a large family gathering. "I want you to tell them for me," Ruth had said during our phone conversation on Thanksgiving morning. "Use the documents I gave you, explain my reasoning, and make sure everyone understands that this decision was made with love and careful consideration for everyone's best interests." So I'd arrived at our Thanksgiving dinner carrying the manila envelope that contained the sale documents, the trust fund paperwork, and Ruth's letter explaining her decision to sell the house and distribute the proceeds among her children. The family gathering had included Michael and me, our children Melanie and her younger brother Jason, Patricia and her husband and 2 teenage children, David and his wife and their adult son, and Karen with her partner and their daughter. It was the kind of large multi-generational gathering that Ruth had always loved hosting, and everyone was disappointed that her health had prevented her from joining us. The conversation during dinner had been pleasant and familiar, with the usual mix of family news, political discussions, and gentle teasing that characterized our holiday gatherings. But I'd noticed that Melanie had been more animated than usual, and she'd steered several conversations toward Ruth's health and care arrangements in ways that seemed designed to establish her authority as Ruth's primary caregiver. "I've been spending a lot of time with Grandma Ruth lately," Melanie had said during one of these conversations. "She's been relying on me more and more for help with important decisions and paperwork." The comment had made several family members exchange glances, and I could see that Patricia in particular was troubled by Melanie's implication that she had special status in Ruth's care arrangements. But it was during dessert that Melanie had made the announcement that forced me to reveal the truth about Ruth's house. "Don't worry about Grandma Ruth's house sitting empty much longer," Melanie had said with obvious satisfaction. "I'll be taking it over soon. It's practically mine already." The silence that followed had been filled with shock, confusion, and the kind of family tension that emerges when someone makes claims that challenge everyone else's understanding of a situation. Patricia had been the first to respond, her voice sharp with surprise and displeasure. "What do you mean you'll be taking over the house?" Patricia had asked. "Has Ruth made some kind of arrangement with you that the rest of us don't know about?" Melanie's response had revealed the depth of her assumptions and the extent of her sense of entitlement. "Grandma Ruth and I have discussed it extensively," Melanie had said with confident authority. "She knows that I'm the one who's been taking care of her, and she wants the house to go to someone who will appreciate it and maintain the family legacy." David had leaned forward with the kind of focused attention that meant he was preparing to ask pointed questions. "Melanie," David had said, "are you saying that Ruth has promised you the house in her will, or are you saying that she's planning to give you the house while she's still alive?" Melanie's answer had been vague but confident. "The details are still being worked out," she'd said, "but the important thing is that Ruth wants me to have the house, and I'm prepared to take on that responsibility." Karen had looked around the table at her siblings with obvious concern. "I think we need to have a family meeting with Ruth about her estate planning," Karen had said. "If she's making decisions about the house, then all of her children should be involved in those discussions. But Melanie had quickly dismissed Karen's suggestion. Ruth doesn't want to be overwhelmed by a bunch of family meetings and discussions, Melanie had said. She's asked me to handle the arrangements because she trusts me to manage things properly. The conversation had been heading toward a family confrontation that would have been painful and potentially damaging to relationships that had taken decades to build. But it was also the moment I'd been waiting for, the moment when Ruth's decision to sell the house would finally be revealed. I'd reached into my purse and pulled out the manila envelope that Ruth had entrusted to me, setting it on the table with the kind of deliberate ceremony that meant I was about to change the direction of our entire conversation. Actually, I'd said, looking directly at Melanie, there's something everyone needs to know about Ruth's house. The room had gone completely silent as I'd opened the envelope and pulled out the documents that would prove that all of Melanie's assumptions and plans were based on a fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. Ruth sold the house 6 weeks ago, I'd announced, spreading the sale documents across the table where everyone could see them. The property has already been transferred to new owners, and Ruth has used the proceeds to establish trust funds for each of her children. The shock that had followed my announcement was absolute and profound, but it was Melanie's reaction that would reveal just how deep her sense of entitlement had become and how far she'd been willing to go to claim what she'd convinced herself was rightfully hers. Melanie's face went through a series of expressions that were painful to witness: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally, a kind of desperate denial that suggested she was refusing to accept what the documents clearly proved. "That's impossible," she said, her voice rising with panic as she reached for the sale papers with trembling hands. "Grandma Ruth would have told me if she was planning to sell the house. We talk about everything." Patricia leaned forward to examine the documents, her expression growing more serious as she reviewed the official paperwork that proved the sale had been completed weeks earlier. "These are legitimate sale documents," Patricia said quietly. "The house was sold on October 15th to Henderson Development Company for $580,000. The reality of the sale was undeniable, but Melanie seemed incapable of processing information that contradicted her fundamental assumptions about her relationship with Ruth and her position in the family hierarchy. "There has to be some mistake," Melanie insisted, her voice taking on the desperate edge of someone who was watching their entire worldview collapse. "Grandma Ruth promised me that house. She told me I was the only one who really understood what it meant to the family." David picked up Ruth's letter from the table and began reading aloud the explanation that Ruth had written for her family. "To my beloved children and grandchildren," David read, "I have made the difficult decision to sell the family house because I believe it's the best way to ensure fairness and financial security for everyone I love." Ruth's letter went on to explain her reasoning in detail, making it clear that the sale had been planned for months and executed with careful consideration for all of her descendants' needs. "I know this decision may come as a surprise," David continued reading, "but I didn't want to burden my children with the responsibility of managing a property that requires significant investment and maintenance. Instead, I've used the proceeds from the sale to establish trust funds that will provide immediate financial benefits, while avoiding the complications that property inheritance often creates." The letter was thoughtful, loving, and completely inconsistent with the promises that Melanie claimed Ruth had made to her about inheriting the house. But instead of accepting Ruth's explanation, Melanie turned on me with an accusation that revealed how distorted her thinking had become. "You convinced her to do this," Melanie said, pointing at me with the kind of angry certainty that comes from refusing to accept personal responsibility. "You were jealous of my relationship with Grandma Ruth, and you talked her into selling the house to spite me." The accusation was so unfair and so far from the truth that it left me speechless for a moment. I'd had nothing to do with Ruth's decision to sell the house, and I'd only learned about it after the sale had already been completed. "Melanie," I said carefully, "I had no influence on Ruth's decision to sell the house. She made that choice independently and told me about it only after the sale was finalized." But Melanie wasn't interested in facts that contradicted her narrative of betrayal and conspiracy. "You've been undermining my relationship with Grandma Ruth for months," she continued, her voice getting louder and more accusatory. "You were always making comments about how much time I was spending with her, trying to make me feel guilty for being a good granddaughter." Michael, who had been listening to this exchange with growing concern, finally intervened with the kind of firm authority that he rarely used with our adult children. "Melanie," he said, "that's enough. Your mother had nothing to do with Ruth's decision, and these accusations are completely inappropriate." But Melanie's anger was beyond reason now, fueled by the humiliation of having her assumptions proven wrong in front of the entire extended family. "This is all wrong," she said, standing up from the table with sharp, agitated movements. "Grandma Ruth wouldn't have sold the house without talking to me first. Someone pressured her into this, and I'm going to find out who." Karen, who had been quietly reviewing the trust fund documents, looked up with a practical question that cut through Melanie's emotional outburst. "Melanie," Karen said gently, "have you actually seen Ruth's will? Has she ever shown you any legal documents that promise you the house?" The question forced Melanie to confront the reality that her expectations had been based on assumptions rather than actual promises or legal commitments. "We discussed it," Melanie said defensively. "Ruth told me how much she appreciated everything I'd been doing for her, and she said she wanted to make sure I was taken care of." "But did she specifically promise you the house?" Karen pressed. "Did she show you will documents or estate planning papers that named you as the heir to the property?" Melanie's inability to answer Karen's question directly revealed that her sense of entitlement had been built on misinterpreted conversations and wishful thinking rather than actual commitments from Ruth. "She didn't need to put it in writing," Melanie said, but her voice lacked conviction. "I knew from the way she talked about the house and the way she included me in decisions about her care that she was planning to leave it to me." Jason, Melanie's younger brother, who had been quiet throughout this confrontation, finally spoke up with an observation that highlighted the problem with Melanie's reasoning. "Mel," Jason said, "being grateful for your help and planning to leave you property are two different things. Maybe you misunderstood what Grandma Ruth was telling you." Melanie turned on Jason with the same anger she'd directed at me, clearly frustrated that even her own brother wasn't supporting her position. "You don't understand, because you haven't been taking care of her like I have," Melanie snapped. "You visit her once a month and think that makes you a good grandson. I've been there for her every week, helping with everything she needs. And that was wonderful of you," Patricia said diplomatically, "but being a devoted granddaughter doesn't automatically entitle you to inherit specific property." Patricia's comment seemed to hit Melanie particularly hard, perhaps because it came from someone whose opinion she'd always respected. "You're all acting like I was being selfish or greedy," Melanie said, tears of frustration starting to form in her eyes. "I wasn't expecting to inherit the house because I wanted money. I wanted it because it represents our family history, and I was the only one who cared enough about that history to preserve it." The claim that she was the only family member who cared about preserving family history was both insulting to everyone else at the table and revealing about Melanie's inflated sense of her own importance within the family structure. "Melanie," I said, trying to reach the rational part of my daughter that seemed to have been overwhelmed by disappointment and embarrassment. "Everyone at this table cares about family history, but caring about history doesn't mean you're entitled to inherit specific property. Besides," David added, "Ruth's decision to sell the house and create trust funds actually preserves family relationships better than leaving property that could cause arguments and financial stress." But Melanie wasn't ready to accept that Ruth's decision had been wise or well-intentioned. She was too invested in her narrative of being the special granddaughter who deserved special treatment. "I can't believe you're all just accepting this," Melanie said, looking around the table at family members who were clearly more interested in understanding Ruth's reasoning than in supporting Melanie's sense of entitlement. Grandma Ruth was obviously confused or pressured into making a decision that goes against everything she really wanted. The suggestion that Ruth was confused, or had been pressured, was particularly offensive, because it implied that an intelligent, capable woman in her 80s was unable to make sound decisions about her own property. "Ruth is not confused," I said firmly. "She's been working with an estate planning attorney for months to organize her affairs carefully and thoughtfully. This wasn't a hasty decision. It was a well-planned strategy for ensuring her family's financial security." But Melanie had moved beyond rational discussion into the kind of desperate thinking that leads people to make increasingly poor choices. "I'm going to contest this," she announced, with the kind of grim determination that suggested she was preparing for a legal battle. "I'm going to prove that Grandma Ruth was coerced into selling the house, and I'm going to make sure her real wishes are honored." The threat to contest Ruth's sale was both legally questionable and personally hurtful, suggesting that Melanie was prepared to drag our elderly family matriarch into a court battle, rather than accept that her expectations had been unrealistic. Michael stood up from the table with the kind of controlled anger that I'd rarely seen from him in our 32 years of marriage. "Melanie," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had reached the end of his patience, "you will not harass your grandmother with legal challenges to decisions she made freely and carefully. If you can't accept Ruth's right to manage her own property as she sees fit, then maybe you need to take some time to think about your priorities." The confrontation between father and daughter was painful to witness, but it was also necessary to establish boundaries around what kind of behavior would be tolerated in response to Ruth's decision. "I'm trying to protect Grandma Ruth from people who are taking advantage of her," Melanie replied, but her argument was losing credibility as it became clear that she was the only person who saw Ruth's decision as problematic. "You're not protecting Ruth," Patricia said bluntly. "You're protecting your own expectations about what you thought you were going to inherit. There's a difference." Patricia's directness seemed to penetrate Melanie's defensive anger in a way that gentler approaches hadn't managed to achieve. "I've been sacrificing my time and energy to take care of her," Melanie said, her voice cracking with emotion. "I've been visiting her every week, helping with her personal care, bringing her home-cooked meals. I've been the one who's been there for her when everyone else was too busy with their own lives." The pain in Melanie's voice was genuine, and it revealed that underneath her sense of entitlement was a deeper hurt about feeling unrecognized and unappreciated for her efforts as Ruth's caregiver. "And Ruth appreciates everything you've done for her," I said gently. "That's why she's included our family in the trust fund distributions. She wants to make sure you benefit from her estate planning, even though she's chosen not to burden anyone with property management." But Melanie wasn't ready to see the trust fund as adequate recognition for her contributions to Ruth's care. "A trust fund isn't the same as inheriting the family home," she said. "The house has sentimental value that can't be replaced with money, sentimental value that apparently wasn't strong enough to prevent Ruth from selling the property," Jason observed with the kind of logical thinking that cut through emotional arguments. Jason's comment seemed to force Melanie to confront the possibility that her understanding of Ruth's attachment to the house had been as inaccurate as her assumptions about inheriting it. "Maybe Ruth felt pressured to sell because she thought the family would fight over the house," Melanie said, grasping for explanations that would preserve her narrative of being wronged. "Or maybe," Karen suggested, "Ruth sold the house because she's a practical woman who wanted to ensure her children's financial security without creating the complications that property inheritance often involves." The conversation was going in circles, with Melanie refusing to accept that Ruth's decision had been voluntary and well-reasoned, while the rest of the family tried to help her understand that her expectations had been based on misunderstandings rather than actual promises. It was Michael who finally broke the deadlock by asking the question that cut to the heart of Melanie's behavior. "Melanie," he said, "what exactly did you think was going to happen when Ruth died? Did you think she was going to leave the house to you exclusively, or did you think you were going to inherit it along with your uncles and aunt?" The question forced Melanie to reveal the extent of her sense of entitlement and the degree to which she'd been planning to claim property that legally belonged to Ruth. "I thought the house would come to me because I was the one who cared about it most," Melanie said, her answer revealing that she'd never considered the possibility that Ruth's other children might also have legitimate claims to their mother's estate. "But Ruth has 4 children, Patricia pointed out. "Did you think we would all just agree to let you have the house while we got nothing?" Melanie's response revealed how completely she'd failed to consider other family members' perspectives or rights. "I thought you'd understand that I was the one who had earned it through everything I'd done for Grandma Ruth," she said, as if caregiving automatically translated into inheritance rights. The conversation had revealed the fundamental selfishness underlying Melanie's position, but it had also revealed something more troubling, her willingness to manipulate Ruth's gratitude and appreciation into expectations of exclusive inheritance. As the evening wound down with strained family relationships and uncomfortable silences, I realized that Melanie's reaction to Ruth's house sale had exposed character flaws that went far deeper than disappointment or embarrassment. My daughter had been willing to claim exclusive rights to property that belonged to someone else, to dismiss other family members' legitimate interests, and to threaten legal action against an elderly woman who had every right to manage her own assets as she saw fit. The battle over Ruth's house was over before it had begun, but the battle for Melanie's character and our family's relationships was just getting started. The real scope of Melanie's deception became clear 3 days after our disastrous Thanksgiving dinner, when Ruth called me with news that transformed our understanding of what had been happening during those seemingly innocent Saturday visits. "Janet," Ruth said, her voice carrying the kind of controlled anger that elderly people use when they've discovered they've been manipulated. "I need to tell you about some documents that Melanie left in my apartment during her last visit." Ruth explained that while cleaning her apartment that morning, she'd found several papers that had apparently fallen out of Melanie's purse during their Saturday visit. Papers that revealed the extent of Melanie's planning and preparation for claiming Ruth's house. "One of the documents is a power of attorney form that would give Melanie complete control over my financial affairs," Ruth said, but it's been partially filled out in handwriting that isn't mine. The implication was clear. Melanie had been preparing to forge Ruth's signature on legal documents that would give her authority to manage Ruth's assets, including potentially reversing the house sale or claiming ownership of the property. There's also a copy of what appears to be a will that names Melanie as the primary beneficiary of my estate, Ruth continued, but it's not a will I've ever seen before, and the signature doesn't look like my handwriting. Ruth had discovered that Melanie had been creating fraudulent legal documents designed to support her claim to Ruth's house and other assets, documents that would have overridden Ruth's actual estate planning if Melanie had been successful in getting them executed. Ruth, I said, feeling sick as I processed the implications of what she was telling me, have you shown these documents to anyone else? I've already contacted my attorney, Ruth replied. He's advised me to report this to the police because attempting to forge someone's signature on legal documents is a serious crime. The revelation that Melanie had been preparing to commit fraud and forgery was devastating, but it also explained her confident assertions about inheriting Ruth's house. Melanie hadn't been operating on assumptions or misunderstandings. She'd been operating on a deliberate plan to steal Ruth's assets through forged documents. I'm so sorry, Ruth, I said. I had no idea that Melanie was capable of something like this. I know you didn't, Ruth replied gently, but I need you to understand that I can't continue to have unsupervised visits with Melanie. I don't feel safe around someone who's been planning to forge my signature and steal my property. Ruth's decision to cut off contact with Melanie was heartbreaking, but necessary, and it meant that our family was about to face the consequences of Melanie's criminal behavior becoming a matter of public record. The police investigation began immediately, with detectives interviewing Ruth about the fraudulent documents and examining Melanie's pattern of behavior during her visits to Sunset Manor. The facility's staff provided security footage that showed Melanie bringing paperwork to Ruth's apartment and becoming visibly frustrated when Ruth refused to sign documents without reading them thoroughly. But the most damaging evidence came from Melanie's own phone and computer, which contained detailed plans for challenging Ruth's house sale and claiming ownership of the property through the forged power of attorney. Melanie had been researching estate law and property transfers for months, Detective Morrison told Michael and me during our interview at the police station. She'd identified specific strategies for overturning property sales and had been preparing legal challenges based on claims of mental incompetence and undue influence. The investigation revealed that Melanie's caregiving relationship with Ruth had been at least partially motivated by her desire to position herself as Ruth's primary heir and to gain access to Ruth's financial information and legal documents. Your daughter had been photographing Ruth's mail, copying account numbers from financial statements, and gathering information that would have allowed her to access Ruth's assets if she'd been successful in executing the forged power of attorney, Detective Morrison explained. The scope of Melanie's planning was breathtaking in its calculated dishonesty, but it was also evidence of premeditation that would make her legal situation much more serious than simple fraud or forgery. Because Melanie was targeting an elderly person and had been planning this scheme for an extended period, she's facing felony charges that could result in significant prison time, Detective Morrison warned us. The possibility that my daughter could go to prison for attempting to defraud her own grandmother was almost impossible to process, but it was also the logical consequence of choices that Melanie had made over months of deliberate planning. When Melanie was arrested at her apartment 2 weeks later, she initially maintained her innocence and claimed that the fraudulent documents had been planted by someone who wanted to damage her relationship with Ruth. "Someone is trying to frame me," Melanie told the police during her initial interview. "I would never forge my grandmother's signature or try to steal her property." But the evidence against Melanie was overwhelming, including her own digital communications about challenging Ruth's house sale and her research into strategies for claiming inheritance through fraudulent legal documents. Faced with evidence that made denial impossible, Melanie's strategy shifted to justification and self-pity. "I was trying to protect Grandma Ruth from people who were taking advantage of her," Melanie told her court-appointed attorney. "Everything I did was motivated by love and concern for her well-being." But Melanie's claim that she'd been acting in Ruth's best interests was contradicted by the evidence of her months-long planning to defraud Ruth and steal her property. The preliminary hearing revealed details about Melanie's scheme that shocked even family members who thought they understood the scope of her deception. Melanie had been using her caregiving relationship with Ruth to gather intelligence about Ruth's finances, her estate planning, and her relationships with other family members. She'd been systematically undermining Ruth's confidence in her own decision-making abilities while positioning herself as the only family member who truly cared about Ruth's welfare. The defendant engaged in a pattern of psychological manipulation designed to isolate the victim from other family members and create dependency on the defendant's assistance, the prosecutor explained during the hearing. Melanie had been telling Ruth that other family members were too busy to visit and that Ruth was lucky to have at least one granddaughter who cared enough to spend time with her. She'd been creating artificial urgency around financial decisions and encouraging Ruth to rely on Melanie's judgment rather than consulting with other family members or professional advisors. Most disturbing, Melanie had been researching Ruth's medication schedule and had been asking questions about Ruth's cognitive abilities that suggested she might have been planning to use claims of mental incompetence to challenge Ruth's estate planning decisions. The defendant had been gathering information that could be used to argue that the victim was not mentally competent to make financial decisions, the prosecutor continued. This suggests a sophisticated understanding of elder abuse tactics and a deliberate plan to exploit the victim's age and health status. The hearing also revealed that Melanie had been in significant personal debt and had been counting on Ruth's inheritance to solve her financial problems. She'd been making purchases and financial commitments based on her expectation of inheriting Ruth's house, creating additional pressure to follow through with her fraudulent scheme. The defendant owed over $80,000 in credit card debt and had been missing payments on her car loan and student loans, the prosecutor explained. Financial records show that she'd been living beyond her means and was facing potential bankruptcy without a significant influx of cash. The financial motive provided context for Melanie's behavior, but it also revealed that her expressions of love and concern for Ruth had been tainted by self-interest and desperation. As the legal proceedings continued, our family struggled with how to respond to Melanie's crimes and how to support Ruth through the trauma of discovering that her granddaughter had been planning to defraud her. Ruth, despite her disappointment and hurt, had been remarkably gracious about the situation. "I feel sorry for Melanie," Ruth told me during one of our conversations. "She must have been very desperate to think that stealing from her grandmother was an acceptable solution to her problems." But Ruth had also been clear that she couldn't maintain a relationship with someone who had violated her trust so completely. "I loved Melanie, and I'm grateful for the genuine care she provided during our visits," Ruth said. "But I can't have a relationship with someone who was planning to forge my signature and steal my property. That kind of betrayal isn't something I can overlook or forgive." Ruth's decision to maintain no contact with Melanie was painful for everyone involved, but it was also necessary for her own safety and peace of mind. Michael and I faced the agonizing choice of whether to support Melanie through her legal troubles or to distance ourselves from someone who had committed serious crimes against a family member we loved and respected. "I don't know how to be her father anymore," Michael told me during one of our many difficult conversations about Melanie's situation. "I raised her to be honest and ethical, and I thought I'd succeeded. Discovering that she's been planning to defraud her grandmother for months makes me question everything I thought I knew about her character." Michael's disappointment in Melanie was profound and personal, reflecting not just his anger about her crimes, but his sense of failure as a father who hadn't recognized the warning signs of his daughter's moral deterioration. "Maybe there were signs that we missed," I suggested. "Maybe her sense of entitlement about Ruth's house was part of a larger pattern of believing she deserved things she hadn't earned." Looking back, there had indeed been signs of Melanie's problematic thinking about money, property, and family obligations. She'd often made comments about investing time and energy in relationships with the expectation of future returns. She'd expressed resentment when gifts or favors weren't reciprocated to her satisfaction. She'd shown a pattern of keeping score in family relationships that suggested she viewed love and loyalty as transactional rather than unconditional. "We should have addressed her sense of entitlement before it evolved into criminal behavior," Michael said. "We should have taught her that caring for family members is its own reward, not an investment strategy for inheritance planning." But our retrospective analysis of Melanie's character development was interrupted by news that would force us to make immediate decisions about our relationship with our daughter. Melanie's attorney had approached the prosecutor about a plea deal that would reduce her charges in exchange for her cooperation in preventing similar elder abuse cases. The deal would require Melanie to plead guilty to attempted fraud and serve 2 years of probation, along with community service and restitution payments to cover Ruth's legal expenses. The prosecutor is willing to recommend the plea deal if Melanie agrees to participate in educational programs about elder abuse and speaks publicly about the consequences of targeting elderly family members for financial fraud, Melanie's attorney explained to us. The plea deal would allow Melanie to avoid prison time, but it would also require her to publicly acknowledge her crimes and accept responsibility for attempting to defraud Ruth. She's asking if you and Michael will attend the hearing where she enters her plea, the attorney continued. She says she wants to apologize to the family and ask for your support as she tries to rebuild her life. Michael and I faced the difficult decision of whether to attend Melanie's plea hearing and what kind of relationship, if any, we wanted to maintain with our daughter after her betrayal of family trust. The choice would define not just our relationship with Melanie, but our understanding of what forgiveness means when someone you love has committed crimes against someone else you love. As we prepared for Melanie's plea hearing, we knew that whatever decision we made would have lasting consequences for our family relationships and our ability to heal from the trauma of discovering that someone we'd trusted completely had been capable of such calculated deception. 18 months have passed since that devastating Thanksgiving dinner, and as I sit in Ruth's apartment at Sunset Manor on this quiet Sunday afternoon, watching her teach my nephew's daughter how to knit the same patterns she once taught Melanie, I'm struck by how profoundly the truth has changed our family's understanding of love, loyalty, and the difference between earning something and feeling entitled to it. The plea hearing that had seemed so important at the time turned out to be just the beginning of a longer journey toward understanding what forgiveness means when someone you love has betrayed someone else you love. Michael and I had ultimately decided to attend Melanie's plea hearing, not to show support for her actions, but to witness her acknowledgement of responsibility and to hear her public apology to Ruth and our family. The courtroom had been nearly empty except for family members, Melanie's attorney and the court personnel, but the weight of the moment had been enormous. I want to apologize to my grandmother, to my family, and to this court for the crimes I committed, Melanie had said when given the opportunity to address the judge. I allowed my financial desperation and my sense of entitlement to convince me that I had the right to take something that didn't belong to me. Melanie's apology had been more honest and comprehensive than I'd expected, acknowledging not just her criminal actions, but the underlying character flaws that had made those actions possible. I convinced myself that my caregiving relationship with my grandmother gave me special rights to her property, Melanie had continued. I was wrong, and I'm ashamed of the pain and betrayal I've caused someone who trusted me and loved me. The judge had accepted Melanie's plea and sentenced her to 3 years of probation, 1,000 hours of community service focused on elder care education, and restitution payments to cover Ruth's legal expenses and security costs at Sunset Manor. But more significantly, the judge had required Melanie to participate in a victim impact program that would help her understand the full consequences of elder abuse and financial fraud. Ms. Henderson, the judge had said, your crimes weren't just against your grandmother's property, they were against her sense of safety, her ability to trust family members, and her peace of mind during what should be the golden years of her life. The victim impact program had apparently been transformative for Melanie, forcing her to confront the emotional damage her actions had caused and to understand that elder abuse isn't just about money, it's about exploiting the vulnerability and trust of people who depend on their families for protection and support. I didn't understand what I was really taking from Grandma Ruth, Melanie had told us during one of our monthly supervised visits that were part of her probation requirements. I thought I was just claiming property that I deserved, but I was actually stealing her sense of security and her ability to trust the people who claim to love her. The supervised visits had been awkward and painful at first, with months of stilted conversations and careful discussions that avoided the emotional landmines of betrayal, disappointment, and lost trust. But gradually, as Melanie had demonstrated genuine remorse and commitment to making amends, our relationship had begun to evolve towards something that resembled healing. I understand if you can never forgive me completely, Melanie had said during one of our more recent conversations. What I did was unforgivable, and I don't expect our relationship to ever be the same. But I want you to know that I'm committed to becoming the kind of person who would never hurt family members the way I hurt Grandma Ruth. Melanie's acknowledgement that our relationship had been permanently changed by her actions had been both painful and necessary. Trust, once broken so completely, can be rebuilt, but never fully restored to its original innocence. The most difficult aspect of Melanie's rehabilitation had been her desire to apologize directly to Ruth and to somehow make amends for the trauma her deception had caused. Ruth had been clear from the beginning that she wasn't interested in maintaining any relationship with Melanie, but she'd eventually agreed to participate in a victim impact meeting that was part of Melanie's community service requirements. "I want Melanie to understand exactly what her actions cost me," Ruth had told the victim advocate who facilitated the meeting. "I want her to know that her betrayal didn't just threaten my financial security, it destroyed my ability to feel safe and comfortable in my own living situation." The meeting between Ruth and Melanie had taken place in a neutral setting with professional mediation, and it had been emotionally devastating for everyone involved. Ruth had described the fear and paranoia that had followed the discovery of Melanie's fraud attempt, the way she'd questioned every interaction with family members and care providers, and the profound loneliness that had resulted from losing trust in the granddaughter who had been her primary companion. "I loved you like my own child," Ruth had told Melanie during the meeting. "I looked forward to your visits. I trusted you with my personal care, and I believed that your affection for me was genuine. Learning that you were planning to forge my signature and steal my property while pretending to care about my well-being was one of the most hurtful experiences of my entire life." Melanie's response to Ruth's statement had been the first time any of us had seen her display genuine remorse rather than self-pity or defensive justification. "I did love you," Melanie had said through tears that seemed to come from a place of authentic grief rather than manipulative emotion. "Everything I felt for you was real, even while I was planning to betray you. That's what makes what I did so horrible. I was able to love you and deceive you at the same time." The victim impact meeting hadn't resulted in reconciliation between Ruth and Melanie, but it had provided closure for Ruth and genuine accountability for Melanie. Ruth had been able to express the full impact of Melanie's betrayal, while Melanie had been forced to confront the reality that good intentions or genuine affection don't excuse criminal behavior. "I hope Melanie learns from this experience and becomes a better person," Ruth had told me after the meeting. "But I can't be part of that learning process. I need to protect myself from people who have demonstrated that they're willing to exploit my trust for their own benefit." Ruth's decision to maintain no contact with Melanie had been wise and necessary, but it had also been a permanent loss for both of them. Melanie had forfeited not just Ruth's trust, but also the relationship that had been genuinely meaningful to both of them before it was poisoned by deception and criminal planning. The ripple effects of Melanie's crimes had extended far beyond her relationship with Ruth, affecting how our entire extended family approached relationships with elderly members and how we thought about caregiving responsibilities and inheritance expectations. Patricia, David, and Karen had all become more vigilant about protecting Ruth from potential exploitation, establishing systems for monitoring her financial affairs, and ensuring that no single family member had exclusive access to her personal information or decision-making processes. What happened with Melanie taught us that we can't assume that family members always have pure motives when they offer to help with caregiving, Patricia had explained during one of our family meetings. "We need to have checks and balances in place to protect Ruth from anyone who might try to take advantage of her vulnerability." The family had also established clearer boundaries around inheritance discussions and estate planning, recognizing that premature expectations about inheritances can create dangerous incentives for manipulation and fraud. "We've agreed that Ruth's estate planning is her private business until she chooses to share information with us," David had said. "None of us should be making assumptions about what we might inherit or positioning ourselves as more deserving than others." The trust funds that Ruth had established from the proceeds of her house sale had provided financial benefits for all of her children, but they had also eliminated the potential for conflicts over property management and inheritance distribution. Ruth's decision to sell the house and distribute the proceeds during her lifetime had proven to be both financially wise and emotionally protective. "Mom was right to sell the house when she did," Michael had reflected recently. "Leaving property to be divided among heirs often creates exactly the kind of conflicts and resentments that she was trying to avoid." But the most significant change in our family had been in how we approach the relationship between caregiving and inheritance expectations. Melanie's crimes had forced all of us to examine our own motivations for spending time with elderly family members and to ensure that our expressions of love and care weren't tainted by financial considerations. "I think we all need to ask ourselves honestly whether we're visiting Ruth because we love her or because we think it will benefit us in some way," Jason had said during one of our family discussions about the lessons we'd learned from Melanie's behavior. Jason's question had been uncomfortable but necessary, forcing each of us to examine our own relationships with Ruth and to ensure that our caregiving was motivated by genuine affection rather than inheritance planning. The community service work that Melanie had been required to complete had focused on educating other families about the warning signs of elder abuse and financial exploitation. Melanie had spoken at community centers, senior living facilities, and family service organizations about her own crimes and the psychological processes that had led her to betray Ruth's trust. I want other families to understand how easy it is for caregiving relationships to become tainted by financial expectations, Melanie had told audiences during her educational presentations. I convinced myself that my grandmother owed me something for the care I was providing, and that sense of entitlement made it possible for me to justify criminal behavior. Melanie's willingness to speak publicly about her crimes had been part of her rehabilitation process, but it had also provided valuable education for other families dealing with similar challenges around aging, caregiving, and inheritance planning. The most dangerous thing about elder abuse is that it often comes from family members who genuinely care about their elderly relatives, Melanie had explained during her presentations. The abuse happens when caregiving becomes transactional, when people start keeping score and expecting rewards for their assistance. Melanie's insight into the psychology of elder abuse had been hard-earned through her own criminal behavior, but it had also been genuinely helpful for families trying to navigate the complex dynamics of caring for aging relatives while managing inheritance expectations. As Melanie's probation period had progressed, she had gradually rebuilt some relationships within our family while accepting that others, particularly with Ruth, would never be restored. She had found work with a non-profit organization focused on elder rights advocacy, using her experience as both perpetrator and reformed offender to help develop prevention programs and support services. I can't undo what I did to Grandma Ruth, Melanie had told me during our most recent conversation, but I can use what I learned from my mistakes to help prevent other families from going through what we went through. Melanie's work with elder rights advocacy had provided her with a sense of purpose and a way to make constructive use of the painful lessons she'd learned through her criminal behavior. She had also been attending therapy and financial counseling to address the underlying issues that had contributed to her decision to commit fraud. I'm learning to distinguish between what I want and what I deserve, Melanie had explained. I think the biggest problem was that I confused my grandmother's gratitude for my caregiving with an obligation to reward me with inheritance. The distinction between gratitude and obligation had become central to our family's understanding of healthy relationships between caregivers and elderly relatives. Love and appreciation don't create debt, and assistance provided to family members shouldn't be viewed as an investment strategy for inheritance planning. As I watch Ruth teaching my great-niece to knit this afternoon, I'm grateful for the lessons we've all learned about the difference between genuine care and transactional relationships. Ruth is surrounded by family members who love her for who she is, rather than what she might leave them, and that authentic affection has provided her with the security and peace of mind that Melanie's deception had temporarily stolen. The house that had seemed so important to Melanie's sense of identity and entitlement has been replaced by something more valuable: trust funds that provide financial security without the complications of property management, and family relationships that are based on love rather than inheritance expectations. Melanie's story serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of entitlement and the importance of maintaining ethical boundaries in family relationships, even when financial pressures and emotional vulnerabilities create temptations to exploit the people we're supposed to protect. But it's also a story about the possibility of redemption and the importance of holding people accountable for their actions while still leaving room for growth and change. Melanie will never fully repair the damage she caused to Ruth and our family, but she's using her experience to help prevent others from making similar mistakes. The sale papers that I'd carried to that Thanksgiving dinner 18 months ago had revealed the truth about Ruth's house, but they had also revealed deeper truths about character, integrity, and what it really means to love someone unconditionally. Sometimes the most important gift we can give our elderly relatives isn't our time or our care. It's our commitment to loving them without expecting anything in return. That's a lesson that Melanie learned too late to save her relationship with Ruth, but not too late to change how she approaches every relationship for the rest of her life. And that's a legacy that even the most valuable house could never provide.